Well, good morning.
Good morning.
It's so good to be back with you this morning. I continue to follow along and to continue to pray for Austin Global Methodist Church as you continue to grow, as you continue to plan and dream. And I continue to ask the Lord's blessing upon you as you bring the gospel of Jesus Christ throughout Austin and beyond. It is my pleasure for me and for my wife Lynn to be with you this morning. And it's hard to believe that it's been over 20 years since I left Asbury there in Corpus Christi. A long time ago already, but I'm not that old, Tom. Somehow I guess time has a way of catching up with us. When Pastor Lauren and I met last year and discussed the possibility of Partners in Hope coming alongside Austin Global Methodist Church as we look at mission work, I knew that mission work was already a forte and a focus of this church. So it's not something we're trying to come and ask you to do more than what you're already doing. All right? But I realized that when we talked about this particular Sunday to start a month-long emphasis where Partners in Hope and Austin Global Methodist could come together, I realized it was going to be Communion Sunday because she asked me to come here on March the 2nd. And I realized that this was going to be a great time for us to gather and talk about the work of mission outreach and work on this day when we come together and remember the suffering and death and service of Jesus Christ on the cross through the sacrament we call the Lord's Supper. Now, I'm sure that Pastor Lauren and other pastors before you, I'm not sure that Tom did this, but I'm sure that most pastors would remind you of what exactly a sacrament is. It is by definition an activity that Jesus himself participated in and commanded his followers to do. For this reason, communion, which we celebrate together today, and baptism are the two universally recognized sacraments of the church. Sacred activities that Jesus both participated in personally and instituted as vital reminders of what sets the church apart from any common organization or endeavor. Well, if the definition of a sacrament is that Jesus commanded them and that they something that Jesus himself participated in and therefore intended for those of us who come after to always do. But let me ask you, should we not also understand that what Jesus did that night, that John wants us to remember when Jesus took the towel and the basin and served his disciples when he washed their feet? And then immediately following that, he commanded them to do likewise and to be prepared to also go out and do these very same things for others after his departure. Well, my friends, does that not also sound just a bit like a sacrament? Something that Jesus wanted those who follow him to both do and never forget. That's why I wanted to spend just a few short moments this morning contemplating one of the most powerful and, dare I say, life-changing passages of Scripture in the entire Bible. And it just so happens to tie nicely in with the ongoing missional work of the Austin Global Methodist Church and Partners in Hope. Because when it comes to living this thing we call the Christian life, nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, is more important and vital to what John remembered about the events that led up to what we know and celebrate as Holy Communion when we this morning receive the bread and the cup. Those of you who are old enough to remember all the way back to 1968, I'm dating myself there. I mean, I had a Pontiac Firebird with an 8-track, all right? Those of you who are old enough to remember that far back and the merger of several different denominations to form what is today the United Methodist Church. Perhaps you remember one of those denominations was the German-speaking Evangelical United Brethren, the EUB Church. And one of the common practices of the EUBs was a regular ritual of foot washing. a sacrament of servanthood, if you will, commemorating Jesus' washing of his disciples' feet. Well, we too, now today, in the Global Methodist Church, can trace this lineage back as well to those EUBs. And so this morning I thought, in this time that we have remaining to us for just a few short moments, I would like to point out just a few things that we can see in John's account of Jesus' institution of this other sacrament that I believe are as important to us as our baptism, that marks us as members of Christ's family, and our sharing in this table that reminds us of Jesus' suffering and death for the forgiveness of sins. Because my brothers and sisters, if we are really honest with ourselves this morning, like our Evangelical United Brethren clearly knew, Jesus' entire life was a sacrament of servanthood. And that is the life to which we, as his followers, are called to participate in and to remember and do every day. So, first thing I'd like to point out is that I believe from what we read in John chapter 13 is that Jesus understood that serving is the deepest expression of God's love. In John chapter 13, verse 1, it was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. And then it says this, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now, I don't know if you've looked at an older version of the NIV lately, but the older version of the NIV actually translates that verse differently than he loved them to the end. If you have one of those older versions, you can look it up and you can see that what it says there is that he loved them to the end, yes, but it also says he now showed them the full extent of his love. Stop and think about that for just a moment. I'm not going to question the editors of the NIV as to why they changed that. But think about that original translation. He now showed them the full extent of his love. Because if you stop and think about that, my friends, think about what that actually means. That means in this week, in the midst of what was going on, right before the Last Supper, right before Judas' betrayal, right before the hours of his trial, his scourging, his nailing to a Roman cross, and yes, right before his resurrection from the dead, John says to us, in that moment of taking that towel and basin, Jesus shows us the full extent of his love. I don't know about you, but I would have thought that God's love would have been a little bit more flashy. Don't you? Like is so often the case, God's ways are not our ways. And God's love is not in the flashy or the audience-pleasing, and it's certainly not in the attention-grabbing showmanship that we may have all come to expect. No, when it comes to God's love, it comes in an ordinary towel and a basin full of water, and a humble servant stooping to do a task that was beneath everyone else in that room to do. You know what that tells me? That tells me that when I want to love others the way that God loves them, there's nothing beneath us that we can do to serve. First church I served in the Southwest Texas Conference many, many years ago was a church called Lake Hill, that's down on Lake Medina. And I remember there was a gentleman in that church by the name of Lester Goots. Lester was one of the nicest gentlemen you will ever meet. He had worked for years in the utilities company in San Antonio and had moved out to Lake Hills to retire. Lester was one of those individuals who any day, any time I walked into the church, it was almost impossible to get there without Lester already being there doing something. He was just one of those guys. Every church has one or two of them. I'll never forget one Sunday morning. I walked in very early, about 6 o'clock in the morning. We lived right behind the church. That was always interesting. I walked in at 6 o'clock in the morning, and guess who was in the sanctuary? Lester Goods. What was Lester doing? Well, Lester was up at the altar, and he was messing with the candles that were there to be lighted in about 3 or 4 hours for our church service. And I just stood in the back of the room and I was watching what he was doing. Lester had discovered that sometimes the acolytes that we use on Sunday mornings would go up there, and the candles that we use, I don't know if they're similar to these up here, they were the type that have the interior part that comes up as the candle melts. And sometimes when the acolytes the week before would snuff out the candle, they would crimp over the wick, so that next week's acolyte would come up and would fight and try to figure out how they could get that candle to light. Well, Lester had decided on Sunday morning at 6 o'clock he needed to drive about 15 miles to come to the church and make sure that that little wick was standing up and an acolyte wouldn't be embarrassed on Sunday morning. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget watching Lester as he lovingly made sure that each wick on those candles was standing perfectly straight, lighting them and folding them and making sure that they were perfect for the acolyte. I will never forget that, because in that little act of service, Lester was taking a towel and a basin and serving. My friends, the point that I don't want us to miss this morning is how small and insignificant our serving others can actually be, and still be the evidence of God's love in a world that is truly looking for love in all the wrong places. John didn't miss it. In fact, John doesn't mention anything about the Lord's Supper in his version of Jesus' story. No, he leaves that to Matthew, Mark, and Luke to record. But taking that towel and that basin, that got John's full attention. And it's amazing how it is so many times the small and the easy to overlook things that we do for one another that are truly the most important and show us the full extent of God's love. Second thing I want to share this morning is that John tells us is that Jesus valued relationships far more than religion. He came to Simon Peter and said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't realize what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash your feet, you have no part with me." You see, what Jesus did that night in washing his disciples' feet was not an altogether unusual occurrence. No, foot washing was a common occurrence in that day. What was unusual is that he, the guest of honor, would do it. As a part of the ritual of all those traditions in that Jewish world, it was customary for a servant to perform this act of ritual washing, cleansing, prior to the beginning of the meal. However, it's in the interchange between Jesus and Peter that we see that this was more to Jesus than just the fulfillment of a religious or even a customary custom. No, his act was that of a loving relationship born out of the previous 3 years with Peter alongside him and participating in Jesus' ministry and life. They were friends. One of the things that attracted me to this ministry called Partners in Hope is that it's not a crisis ministry. Oh, we need crisis ministries, don't misunderstand me. And there are some great crisis ministries here in Austin and all around the world. But Partners in Hope is not a crisis ministry. We don't try to come in and fix things that are broken or that need to be done so that we can move on to the next crisis or disaster. No, in the Partners in Hope model, it's a one-year commitment to an individual or to a family to build relationships and help connect them to other individuals and organizations that these individuals and families need to get whatever they need, but mostly try to get them and help them to get out of isolation. Ultimately, and we don't make any bones about this, our goal is to see to it that the people that we come alongside get connected to a local church. Because you see, we believe it's in the local church that people find the true community and relationships that are truly life-changing. Now, I'd love to share a whole lot more about Partners in Hope this morning, but that's not my ultimate goal. What I want to share with you is that we have no trouble finding people who are isolated. Isolated people live on every street in the greater Austin area and beyond. What's difficult sometimes is finding churches and even Christians who are interested and understand that what these families really need is not a one-time get their yard mowed or their plumbing fixed. No, what they need is far more important than that. Lynn and I were there in Lake Hills, living right behind the church, and one night we came back from an outing in San Antonio. I guess it was about 40 miles away. We came pulling in, and it was getting ready to rain. And we had a small pop-up camper. And it was getting ready to rain. I didn't want it to get wet, so I went outside as Lynn went inside with our children to get them ready for bed. And you know how you all of a sudden have that sudden feeling like someone is somewhere where they should not be? Now, we're out in the middle of Lake Hills. It's no longer a small community, but it was out there at that time. At the end of a dirt road, here we are. There's someone in our pop-up camper. I went into fight or flight mode. I didn't know what to do. All of a sudden, as my eyes accustomed themselves to the dark, I realized that there was a small boy lying on one of the beds in our pop-up. I brought him inside. He just had a pair of cut-off shorts on, no shirt, no shoes, and I realized that wherever he had come from, he had to walk all the way down that dirt road without shirt, without shoes, and had come down and found a place in our pop-up to spend the night. He had cigarette burns on his arms, and this little boy was filthy. Lynn took him in, got him showered, got him cleaned up. Well, I called the constable. As soon as I mentioned what was going on, the constable said, "Oh, I know exactly who that is. This is not the first time he's run away, and with good reason." I share all that to share with you that after the constable came and took this little boy away and got him wherever he needed to go that night, 3 days later, I walked into our house, and Lynn is sitting in a chair with the look on her face. Guys, do you know the look?
Yeah.
And I'm immediately thinking, what did I forget? Was it our anniversary? Was it her birthday? What's going on? I said, "Honey, what's the matter?" And she says to me, "You and I are going to become foster parents." I thought that was the dumbest thing I'd ever heard in my life. We had 2 small children of our own. We were just getting started in ministry. And here was Lynn, because of what had happened that night, saying to me, "We are going to become foster parents." And I put my foot down and I said, "No way." And 3 weeks later, we had our first foster child in our house. I mean, it happened fast. I think Dr. Jack Daniels was involved with the Methodist home at the time that we became foster parents for the Methodist home services. 15 or 16 foster children later, we had a lot of opportunity to watch these children come into our homes. You know what? They always showed up with their baggage. And I'm not just talking about the little, sometimes sack or little bag that they had. They came with all kinds of stuff that they carried with them. They would walk in and their eyes would be big. Here's this 6'6", galoot standing there. And Lynn, her loving, caring presence. How silly would it have been if Lynn and I said to those children, "Welcome to the Rogers household. There's the kitchen. There's your bedroom. Laundry room's there. Trash goes out on Thursday. Don't bother us. We don't want anything else." No. You see, like foster children, people who are isolated don't just need something. They need someone. And so when it comes to the work of Partners in Hope, we're not in the business of giving people something. We want them to have and know someone. My brothers and sisters, is there anyone on your street, in your neighborhood? Maybe you haven't seen them in a while. Maybe there's something that's going on. Maybe you know that they lost a spouse or something has happened in their lives, and you just haven't seen them out and about lately. Their yard's getting a little shabby. Things are starting to kind of fall out onto the front porch a little bit. Well, anyone can go and mow their grass. Anyone can do the things that need to be done to get their house looking a little bit better. But you know what they really need? They need you. They need you and me to come into their life, not to take over, but to simply provide them love, care, support, and ultimately the someone that we know as Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. The third and final thing we have time to look at today is how Jesus wanted to make sure that his followers would always have a reminder of how serving has nothing to do with the deserving of those we serve. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you not understand what I've done for you? He said. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. You know, when those 12 men in that room heard that, I wonder if they thought that Jesus was simply stating the obvious. That the example that he had set in serving them, his most faithful and closest friends, would forever serve as a reminder, a heart-warming and, shall we say, sacramental memorial of how those who claim to be his followers and who are therefore part of the worthy and deserving crowd should always treat one another. I mean, obviously, we should care for one another in the church. We're part of the in crowd. However, did you ever stop to think about just how undeserving those men really were? I came across something that Max Lucado wrote in his book, Just Like Jesus. Lucado says, you can be sure that Jesus knows the future of those feet that he is washing. These 24 feet will not spend the next day following their master, defending his cause. These feet will dash for cover at the flash of a Roman sword. Only one pair of feet won't abandon him in the garden. One disciple won't desert him at Gethsemane, and Judas won't even make it that far. He will abandon Jesus that very night at that table. Lucado goes on, I looked for a Bible translation that reads, Jesus washed all the disciples' feet except the feet of Judas. But I couldn't find one. What a passionate moment when Jesus suddenly and silently lifts the feet of his betrayer and washes them in that basin. And within hours, the feet of Judas, cleansed by the kindness of the one he will betray, will stand in Caiaphas' court. Behold the gift Jesus gives to his followers. He knows what these men are about to do. He knows they are about to perform the vilest act of their lives. By morning, they will bury their heads in shame and look down at their clean feet in disgust. And when they do, he wants them to remember how his knees knelt before them and he washed their feet. He wants them to realize those feet are still clean. Remarkably, he knew their sin before they even committed it. He offered mercy before they even sought it. And might I add, he served them like he expected them to serve others before they had done anything to deserve it. Serving people that don't deserve it's not easy. It flies in the face of absolutely everything we feel inside. Well, they didn't even say thank you when we got done doing the work for them. How in the world can we go back and do anything more? I don't know about you, my friends, But when I approach this table in a few moments, it's not because I deserve what Christ is offering me. In fact, it's the exact opposite that is the case. We come to this table, this sacrament, undeserving of anything that we receive. Can our serving of others be anything else? In just a few minutes, we, along with members of the Global Methodist Church and along with believers literally around the world, we will participate in Holy Communion as baptized members of the church. In other words, both universally accepted sacraments will be on display in this very room. However, my friends, John reminds us as Jesus' actions that night before the Last Supper, as he took that towel and that basin and washed his disciples' feet, Jesus was giving them a sacrament for all the days in between Sundays when we approach this table that we do not deserve. Every time we serve others, we have the opportunity to show them the full extent of God's love, no matter how small the task and service might be. We have the opportunity to show them that God is more interested in relationships. God is interested in them more than religion. And we also can still make Jesus visible in the world that does not deserve him, but that he wants us to offer them his grace. Partners in Hope looks forward to this month and beyond in whatever way that we can work together with and through the ministries and the fine people of Austin Global Methodist Church. We thank you for this privilege. We thank you for the opportunity to serve as we, along with you, take our towel and our basin